So, to switch the discussion to what Eric and Larry asked me to talk about, kind of a brief personal background before I start talking about the subject matter. I grew up on a fruit and vegetable farm in northeast Ohio in the snow belt south of Lake Erie, in the wine belt and fruit belt region. We were growing, had a very small 25-acre farm growing fresh market fruits and vegetables. We had 4 primary crops that represented about 80% of the total acreage that we were growing, and those 4 crops were cantaloupe, cucumbers, zucchini, and tomatoes. So we additionally did green beans and onions and a number of other crops as well, but those 4 represented the majority of what we were growing. In the early 2000s, 2002, 3, and 4, we had a 3-year consecutive period with major climate stress, a lot of very wet weather, and we lost the majority of our crops 3 years in a row to a variety of different disease and insect pests, bacterial speck and bacterial spot on tomatoes, powdery mildew on the cucurbit crops, and we were constantly seeing decreasing effectiveness from fungicide and insecticide applications. We were putting together all kinds of tank mixes, the latest, most recently released products, and the effectiveness kept going down and down and down. So after 3 years of substantial crop losses, we knew that we had to make a significant change, and we had to change very quickly or we were not going to be farming very long in the future. In 2004, the last year, that 3-year period, we had a very interesting experience in which we began also farming a neighboring field, a field from a neighboring farm that bordered right up against one of our own fields. Because of the field slope, what had been 2 long, narrow strips, 2 long, narrow fields that were being tilled up and down the slope, we now started tilling this field across the slope and planting crops across the slope. So crops are being planted across the field border. Right out beside the road, where everyone could see it driving by, we planted a crop of cantaloupe. At harvest, the soil that we have been growing vegetables on for the past decade had 80% of the leaves were infected with powdery mildew. On the new soil, there was no powdery mildew. Not as in 5% or 10% leaf infection, but you couldn't find any powdery mildew. There was no powdery mildew in the entire field. And it was so pronounced, there was such a clean line, there was like a knife line right down through the center of the field. In fact, it was so pronounced that in some of the rows, there were healthy vines growing right in amongst the unhealthy vines. And that was the real light bulb moment for me. I wanted to know, what are the differences between these 2 plants and what allows one plant to be resistant to powdery mildew when the next plant right beside it is susceptible. It was the same variety, it was planted the same day, same fungicide and insecticide applications, same nutrient applications, but 2 completely different results, 2 completely different responses. So I had always had a very strong interest in plant nutrition and plant physiology, and I started asking a lot of questions from all the connections that I had in the industry, wanting to understand what the differences were between these 2 plants. Did a tremendous amount of research, did a lot of reading, and I was able to develop a group of mentors who guided me in a lot of the research that I did. And what I learned, very simply, in its simplest form, is that plants have an immune system exactly the same way that we do. We understand that all of us have our own immune system, yet our immune systems do not all work equally well. All of us have friends who become ill with the first cold or flu bug that comes along, and then we know other people who practically never become ill. And the only difference between those 2 is how well their immune system has been supported with nutrition over the course of their entire lifetime. Not in the last 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months, but all the way up from even before they were born. The same concept holds true for plants. So this then led the work that we did on the farm. We started managing plant nutrition on our farm completely differently. In 2005, 2006, we did a lot of experimentation. By 2006, we went completely pesticide-free on the farm. That farm has been completely pesticide-free ever since, and is not organically certified, and have no intention of becoming organically certified on that operation. Then from that work that we did on the farm, other farmers started asking us to do consulting work for them, and we founded Advancing Eco Agriculture as a consulting company. Several years ago, we also started doing some product manufacturing, but what we have really become known for is helping farmers grow crops that are resistant to disease and insect pests by using nutrition. So what I wanted to talk about this morning is kind of the 3 different pieces that I described How is it that how do we manage disease and insect pests using nutrition? How do we manage fruit quality? And how do we improve yields? Because there are some very fundamental concepts that are completely, that are not commonly discussed in production agriculture that are very, very important. So first, how do we manage diseases? How we think differently about immune systems and managing disease. So when I talk to groups of agronomists, I teach dozens of seminars and dozens of presentations across the country every winter. And when I talk about plant immune system, a very common response is that there is no scientific substantiation for plant immune systems. Nobody in the agronomy world has ever talked about plant immunity. And yet there is a tremendous amount of research that was done in the botany department of major land-grant universities. There are entire scientific journals and books that have been published about plant immune systems. But that information is not being transferred to production-scale agriculture. And yet the information is all there. So there are a lot of books that have been published about plant immune systems. One of the most valuable is this book, which is co-edited by Lawrence Datnoff, Wade Elmer, and Don Huber, titled Mineral Nutrition and Plant Disease. This book is a tremendously valuable resource. It costs about $90 or $95 on Amazon, and it's worth 10 times that much, 100 times that much to any farmer. There are, in this book clearly describes many very specific associations between specific diseases and specific mineral imbalances. So based on the research that I was doing on plant immune systems and mineral nutrition management, it seemed to me that it should be possible for us to predict disease or insect susceptibility based on a plant's nutritional profile. And yet, we were never able to do that with tissue analysis. So when we go to a doctor, we're not feeling well, and there aren't really any clear symptoms, the doctor finds it difficult to make a diagnosis, the first thing that they will do is to order a blood analysis. And that blood analysis will be a nutritional profile. They will use that nutritional information to help them understand what is happening in our body, with our body's physiology, and use that information to help them make a diagnosis. All the research is present, and all the research has been done to indicate that it should be possible to do exactly that same thing with plants. And yet, we have never been able to do that with tissue analysis. We have not been able to correlate the results from tissue analysis with what is actually happening in the field. So this is really what led to the genesis of us using plant sap analysis, which is a technology that was developed in the Netherlands. I'll talk about sap analysis in just a bit, but what I can say right now is that the use of sap analysis has allowed us to very accurately predict not only when a plant is going to be susceptible to diseases or insects, but in some cases, when we have enough experience with a specific crop, we can also identify precisely which disease or which insect a crop is going to be susceptible to based on that plant's nutritional profile. That is incredibly powerful information, because now that also means we have the information and knowledge on how to manage nutrition to prevent those diseases or insects from ever becoming a challenge in the first place. So, I'd like to share a story about apple scab as an illustration for how we think differently about managing disease. One of the core strategies that we use for disease management, for pathogen management, is very simply removing the food source. Every single pathogen, every disease pathogen, and every insect has very specific nutritional requirements for a very specific profile. They have a specific requirements for specific amino acids, and they also have requirements for a very specific carbohydrate profile. And this information, this is all information that has been researched and studied for decades. A lot of it is available, or very readily available. And when we match that information with what is happening in plants and understand plant physiology, we can now look at this and say, okay, how can we manage these plants to remove the food source? So if we look at apple scab, in the early 1950s, there was an extensive research report published by McGill University on apple scab, and they described the nutritional requirements, the amino acid profile, the carbohydrate profile required for apple scab, and they identified that in particular, apple scab is completely dependent on one specific amino acid, the amino acid arginine. When the apple tree does not have arginine, the amino acid arginine, apple scab cannot survive. So many of the early apple scab treatment products that were developed and released on the marketplace were simply arginine inhibitors. They prevented the plant from forming that specific amino acid. Now, we know that there are some varieties that are very resistant to apple scab, and there are other varieties that are susceptible to apple scab. And when I started looking at apple scab and what was happening in the plant's physiology, I asked the question, what are the differences between these two characteristics? Why are some varieties resistant and others are susceptible? So I started looking at the arginine metabolic pathway, and I was able to identify that because, let me just back up a step. Plants should not accumulate any soluble amino acids. All those amino acids should be converted to peptides and then transferred to complete proteins. So a healthy plant will not accumulate high levels of any amino acid, including arginine. So I asked the question, why are these plants accumulating high levels of arginine, and what is missing that the arginine is not being transferred on to complete proteins? So when we look at the enzyme pathway, the metabolic pathway, the reason we have high levels of arginine is because we have cobalt deficiencies. Cobalt is the enzyme cofactor that is required for a plant to process and convert arginine to peptides and then to complete proteins. So we started doing some experimentation 4 years ago. This is an apple orchard in central Pennsylvania, producing a number of different apple varieties. They have other tree fruit as well. These are Gala apples, and the year prior, they had such severe scab infection, even with intense treatment applications, that 100% of their Gala crop went for processing. They had no Gala that qualified for fresh market because of the severe scab infections. We started working with that crop in spring, and with half a dozen cobalt applications, foliar applications of cobalt, along with a combination of other nutrients, we were able to reduce the fungicide, not the fungicide, but the bactericide applications by 30%, and we had a completely scab-free crop. Again, in a very heavy scab pressure year, when there were other surrounding orchards in the immediate neighborhood that still had very severe scab infections. So we're able to completely reduce scab simply by managing cobalt. And then we also started, as we started working with a number of different apple producers, we were able to develop, with SAP analysis, we were able to develop a database of and compare the apple scab resistant varieties and the susceptible varieties. And we soon noticed that there was one very distinct difference between the varieties that were resistant and those that were susceptible. The varieties that were resistant to apple scab were doing a much better job of picking up cobalt from the soil. They had higher cobalt concentrations in and of themselves. And as a result of that, they were much more resistant to scab. So I use apple scab as an example because it is a comparatively simple example. There's only one single moving part, one specific amino acid. But when growers or consultants ask us in our work at Advancing Eco-Agriculture to begin working with a disease or begin working with a specific crop disease combination, this is when you ask us the question, what can I do about XYZ disease? Our answer is never going to be that you need to apply a certain fungicide or need to apply a certain product. That's not how we think. We always try to identify what is the root cause. Why do we have this disease expressing itself in the first place? And what can we do about it, and how can we manage it in that way? So there's obviously a number of there's many different diseases that I could talk about, but I'm going to try to continue moving through some of the different discussion points, then open it up for questions and answers so that I can answer any questions that you guys have. If we look at bacterial canker, Pseudomonas syringae in cherries, which is supposedly the incurable disease for cherry production, we've been able to completely reverse bacterial canker on cherries with by supplying adequate levels of manganese. So as we have worked with many different farmers, different environments, different climates, different crops, we have observed a commonality where we have a distinct evolution of plant health, where plants become resistant to different groups of diseases, different groups of insects at different stages of physiological integrity and nutritional integrity. So we put together this diagram that we call the plant health pyramid to really describe what it is that we are seeing in the field. So at the foundation, the plant health pyramid, we have plants that begin forming complete carbohydrates and higher levels of complete carbohydrates. They're photosynthesizing very efficiently, and every 24-hour photocycle, they're producing about 60 to 80% of their total photosynthetic efficiency. Most crops today are only at about 20 to 30%. So we're talking about increasing every 24-hour photoperiod sugar production by a factor of 3 or 4 times. The second level of the plant health pyramid is when plants begin forming complete proteins, which means they no longer have any soluble amino acids or soluble nitrates in the plant sap. The third level is when they have a surplus of energy, and they store that surplus energy in the form of fats and oils. And then the fourth level is those lipids that are produced at level 3 are now used as the foundational building blocks to build what in plain English we call essential oils. All plants build essential oils. So these are compounds that are referred to as plant secondary metabolites. They're phytoalexins, terpenoids, sesquiterpenes, bioflavonoids, resveratrol, anthocyanins in blueberries, for example. These are all the compounds that give flavor to fruit and that give quality to fruit. So these compounds that plants produce at the fourth level of the plant health pyramid are the foundation and the basis for a plant's immune system. They are designed and developed as plant protectants to protect plants from ultraviolet radiation, insect attack, disease attack, overgrazing. And at this point, at the top level of the pyramid, we have plants that have an incredible degree of resilience, climate resilience, and resistance to a variety of different diseases and insects. And the interesting part is that they now also have the capacity to transfer that immunity to the people who consume that food. Blueberries, for example, are known as a very immune-enhancing food because of the high anthocyanin content. According to Michigan State University, the anthocyanin content of blueberries can vary by a factor of 25x. 25 times variability of the anthocyanin content purely based on variety and environment. So we see that plants become resistant to different groups of organisms at different stages of nutritional integrity and physiological development. So at this first stage, at the beginning of the plant health pyramid, when plants begin forming complete carbohydrates, they now become resistant to all the soil-borne fungal pathogens, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium, Verticillium, Phytophthora, etc. Because all of those pathogens are dependent, they will only attack a root system that has very high levels of soluble sugars and does not have good electrical conductivity. The second level is when they begin forming complete proteins. That means you now have a plant that has very low levels of nitrates and soluble amino acids in the plant sap, and you have removed the food source for all the insects that have simple digestive systems. So these would be insects such as aphids, whiteflies, leafhoppers, all the larval insects such as European corn borer, cabbage looper, tomato hornworm, codling moth, etc. They are all dependent on soluble nitrates and amino acids as a food source, and you can completely remove that by ensuring that plants produce complete proteins. So at the third level, when they begin forming higher levels of lipids, they now become resistant to all the airborne fungal and bacterial pathogens. So I'm talking about bacterial speck, bacterial spot, fire blight, late blight, downy and powdery mildew, leaf mold, angular leaf spot, and on and on. At the fourth level, and only at the fourth level, do these plants become resistant to all the beetles that have much more sophisticated digestive systems. I'm talking about Colorado potato beetle, Japanese beetle, marmorated stink bug, corn rootworm beetle, cucumber beetle, and so forth. So there is a tremendous amount of science behind this chart. I could talk about that chart for 4 hours alone, but I wanted to just give you a very brief overview. So when we think about diseases and insects, we are constantly thinking about where on this chart do those diseases and insects fit on the spectrum, and how can we manage nutrition to remove the food source so that plant is no longer susceptible. So to accomplish these results, one of the tools that we started using 5 years ago was plant sap analysis. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about plant sap analysis and the differences between plant sap and tissue analysis. How many of you in here use tissue analysis? Most of you do? Okay. Good. So plant sap analysis is completely different from tissue analysis. The results are completely different, they're reported completely differently, and they need to be understood completely differently. So just to give you a comparison, when we are collecting tissue analysis, we select the last fully mature leaf, send that to the laboratory. When the laboratory receives this sample, they dehydrate it, ash it, and then the minerals from that sample are reported on a dry matter basis. What proportion of the total dry matter is calcium and magnesium and potassium and so forth. With plant sap analysis, we collect 2 samples instead of 1. We collect that same leaf, the last fully mature leaf at the top of the shoot, and then we collect an old leaf that is at the bottom of the plant, one of the oldest leaves that is still vital and green and growing well. We take these 2 samples separately, we send them to the laboratory separately, and then the laboratory, instead of dehydrating them, they have perfected a process for extracting the plant sap out of those leaves without any dehydration. So they are extracting the plant sap, and then they are analyzing that sap and reporting the nutrient content contained within the sap itself. This is what we have observed is that, first of all, this method of analysis is much more sensitive and much more accurate and correlates with what is actually happening in the field much more closely than tissue analysis ever did. However, there is another very strong advantage, which is that with sap analysis, we are able to detect nutrient deficiencies 3 to 4 weeks earlier than we are with a tissue analysis. So let's say that we have a strawberry crop that is growing very vigorously in early spring, and it's beginning to bloom and blossom, starting to fill fruit. And one day, the soil is no longer able to supply that plant's requirements for calcium. So it's had a constant supply of calcium up to this point, has had adequate levels of calcium. And so now, because it has adequate levels of calcium, we have all the cells within that leaf structure have adequate calcium in the cell membranes. And on this day, when all of a sudden calcium availability drops. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that calcium availability drops by 60%. If you take an analysis a week later, if you take a leaf analysis, you send that to the laboratory, and they analyze it on a dry matter tissue analysis, they will show that you have adequate levels of calcium because you still have all the calcium that was contained within the cells and within the leaf structure. If you take a sap analysis, it will show that the calcium level has dropped in the plant sap and that you actually have a calcium deficiency. This is incredibly powerful because it now gives us a 3 to 4 week time advantage that we have this information, that we can correct deficiencies before they ever become visually expressed, and we can actually manage nutrition much more proactively than we have been able to with tissue analysis. So there's also a very important reason why we take samples from both the old leaves and the new leaves, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So I co-founded a company called Crop Health Labs based out of Ohio, and Del and Eric and Larry have been working with Crop Health Labs, and we'll be working with you to facilitate the use of plant sap analysis with this laboratory. So this is a nutrient interactions diagram called the Mulder chart that describes nutrient interactions in plant leaves. All of you have seen this chart at some point, right? You've all memorized it? Why not? It's not that difficult. No, obviously this chart is it's very complicated, it's very convoluted. There's a lot of information describing the synergistic and antagonistic relationships of nutrients within plant structure. And the team in the Netherlands who developed plant sap developed their own diagram to describe nutrient interactions as they were able to see them with sap analysis. And I then modified the diagram that they put together, and it isn't completely perfect. There are some things that don't show up, but it is much simpler and much easier to understand. So this is the nutrient interactions chart that we developed. So if you look at this chart, the top half of the chart, we have all the macronutrients, all the major elements: calcium, potassium, magnesium, sodium, and ammonia, nitrate, sulfur, chloride, phosphorus. The bottom half of the chart, we have all the various trace minerals. The left side of the chart, we have all of the cations, the positively charged elements. On the right side of the chart, we have all the negatively charged elements. Now, when we talk about soil analysis, we understand that soil has a finite mineral holding capacity. We call it CEC, cation exchange capacity. Each soil type can only hold so many cations, and it can also only hold so many anions. And yet, we have not considered that that might also be a possibility for plants, where each plant cell is going to have a finite mineral holding capacity. So what the team in the Netherlands identified is that they identified that these plants, each plant has a finite mineral holding capacity for cations. It can only hold so many cations, and it can only hold so many anions for these macronutrients. And so that means that when we have an excess of one of these elements, it is going to create a deficiency of something else. So this is a very, very powerful point and a very key point. Within agriculture, we have tended to operate within the paradigm that our nutrient imbalances and the nutrient deficiencies that we're working with on crops are a result of not having enough product, and we're constantly applying more. We need to put on more manganese, we need to put on more zinc, we have to put on more phosphorus, more calcium, whatever is deficient. As we've worked with SAP analysis for the last 5 years, it's been our observation that 80% of the nutrient imbalances for all of these macronutrients, the major elements across the top half of the chart, 80% of all the imbalances of those macronutrients are caused by the excesses of products that farmers apply, creating a deficiency of something else. We have actually been able to save the farmers that we're working with a tremendous amount of money from reduced fertilizer applications simply by understanding the nutrient interactions. So there's one specific interaction that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a bit here, and that is the interaction between potassium and calcium. Potassium and calcium are very strongly antagonistic to each other, and the relationship and understanding the relationship and how to manage those two elements is at the foundation of managing all fruit quality problems. So you want to talk about blossom end rot, cork, bitter pit, small fruit, misshapen and misformed fruit. 80% of those problems are a direct result of not properly managing the balance and the ratios between those two elements, and I want to describe how that works. So, Eric, when is shut-off time? 11:30? 11:30. 11:30. Thank you. So, I'm going to have to move through some of this. So there are these four elements that I've highlighted. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium are considered to be highly mobile. NPK, magnesium are highly mobile. They move around in plant structure wherever plants need them. So, and they move around very quickly. Within a matter of 24 hours, they can move very quickly. So when plants are growing, they will do everything they possibly can to keep the new growth at the top of the plant healthy. They will keep the nutrition at that new growth balanced to the best degree possible, which means that when they have a deficiency of one of these elements, they will pull one of these elements out of the lower older leaves and move it up to the upper part of the leaf, to the upper part of the shoot. Or if they're filling fruit, they will move it into the fruit. As soon as the soil is unable to supply the requirements for one of these elements, they will sabotage the lower older leaves and move it up to the upper part of the plant, which means that deficiencies of these elements are always going to show up on the oldest leaves first, not at the new leaf at the top, which is why one of the reasons why tissue analysis has been so inaccurate is because when we're only selecting leaf samples at the top, the newest, last fully mature leaf, it is not detecting deficiencies of these four elements. The same also holds true for sodium, sulfur, and chloride to a slightly lesser degree. These elements are also very mobile, but they're not as highly mobile as the other four elements. So if you look at this, this means that these elements, all these macronutrients across the top of the chart, are all mobile. They move around in plant structure with the exception of calcium. Calcium is not mobile and does not move around. What this means is that when we measure new leaves at the top, old leaves at the bottom, and we compare those numbers, we can see how plants are moving nutrients around inside the plant structure, and we can immediately tell whether they have a deficiency of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, or whether they have an excess and a surplus. When they have a surplus, they store the surplus down the lower older leaves. When they have a deficiency, they rob the lower older leaves. It's an incredibly valuable tool. It also means that we are no longer dependent on a laboratory and laboratory defined standards as this is what the requirements are for this specific crop. It allows the plants to speak to us and tell us exactly what their nutritional requirements are. This is very powerful and very exciting for me. And the other thing that it allows us to do for the first time is to predict disease and insect susceptibility. So several years ago, one of the consultants on our team started working with a hops grower in Washington. And we have, after harvest, they have been collecting sap samples. It's one of the pieces that I failed to mention. We use sap analysis as a proactive management tool, not as a reaction process when we see a problem out there and going out and collecting tissue analysis. We do not react to problems. We use it proactively, and for many of the crops that we work with, we recommend our growers to collect a sap sample every 2 weeks throughout the entire growing season, from beginning to end. It is really valuable information because it allows us to both manage nutrition in the growing season, but it also allows us to manage nutrition year over year. So if we're growing a tomato crop, for example, we may see that we have this tomato crop has a generous supply of potassium all the way up the growing season until a certain point in mid-August, potassium levels just crash. That allows us to then next year, the following year, make certain that we put on a dry soil application of adequate levels of potassium with a specific timing to address that potassium imbalance and prevent that problem from happening again in the future. So this hops grower had collected sap analysis every 2 weeks throughout the growing season up until harvest, and they wanted me to also look at the data that they had collected and all the information that they had put together. So we put together a conference call. On the conference call, there were 3 people from the farm. There's the farm owner and the field manager and their agronomist. There are 3 people from the team. This is the largest hops grower in Washington. And then on our team was our consultant, Gary Redding, and myself. So they sent over an email with all of their sap analysis data just several minutes before the call. And we got into the conference call, and I told them, I told the ranch owner, I said, look, I know absolutely nothing about growing hops. I have never worked with hops ever before, and to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen a live hops plant in my life. I have no idea what I'm talking about. And so his response was, he said, well, between the 3 of us on the call here on our end, we have a combined 81 years of experience in hops production, and we think that with our experience in hops production and your knowledge of plant physiology and plant nutrition, we should be able to work together and figure this out. So I started asking a bunch of questions about their nutrient applications and foliar sprays and irrigation system to try to understand some of the nutrient fluctuations that I was seeing in the trends and the data. And then about 15 minutes into the call, I said, okay, so again, with the qualifier, I'm not familiar with this crop. I don't know what diseases or insects it's susceptible to, if any, but based on my experiences with other crops, I would predict that this crop is going to be very susceptible to either downy or powdery mildew. I'm not sure which, but it's going to be one of those 2. I would suspect this crop is likely to be very susceptible to whiteflies and very susceptible to spider mites. There was dead silence on the phone for a few seconds, and then the farm owner said, well, maybe you know more about growing hops than we do. Their top 3 pest challenges were spider mites and whiteflies and powdery mildew. I was, yes! That was a really exciting moment because for the first time, we now had a laboratory analysis that was accurate enough that we were able to predict disease or insect susceptibility based on a plant's nutritional profile. And that was with knowing absolutely nothing about what that crop's nutritional requirements were, but understanding very well what the nutritional requirements were of those specific pathogens. So this has the potential to be an incredibly valuable tool. I believe very strongly that in the next decade, plant sap analysis is going to completely replace and completely eliminate tissue analysis because it is such a valuable and such an accurate tool. So the second piece that I'd like to talk about is that we think very differently about fruit quality. And earlier I mentioned that 80% of all fruit quality problems are direct directly caused by imbalances and mismanagement of calcium and potassium. And so I'd like to talk about how that happens and what's going on. So when, first of all, before I get into this discussion, how many of you guys in here grow strawberries? A few of you. And other berry crops, blueberries, raspberries, and so forth? A number of you as well. How many are tree fruit growers? Apples, pears? Okay, quite a variety. So after a blossom pollinates, and I don't care if we're talking about raspberries or blackberries or apples or pears or tomatoes, this plant physiology is all the same across the board. After a blossom pollinates, for a 10 to a 14-day period, this is going to vary by crop and vary by climate a little bit, but for the most part we have about a 10 to 14-day period after initial pollination where this embryo is going through what is called the cell division stage. So in the cell division stage, in this 10 to 14-day period, we have extremely rapid cell multiplication, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so forth. So we have this explosion of the number of cells contained within that embryo. And then, when it reaches the end of the cell division stage, that cell division stops. There is no more cell division for the rest of the growing season. So that means that the potential fruit size is going to be limited by the number of cells that is formed in that 2-week period. And the number of cells formed in that 2-week period is going to be limited by calcium availability. This 2-week window is your golden window of opportunity to get calcium into the fruit, because these fruit and these embryo need tremendous amounts of calcium to form all the cell membranes so they can facilitate constant cell division, very aggressive cell division. So if you can get large quantities of calcium into the embryo in the first 2 weeks after pollination, you can eliminate and remove many calcium quality problems such as blossom end rot. That first 2-week time window is golden. So then, after cell division, these plants switch to cell expansion. And so for the remainder of the growing season, all these cells have already been formed. They are now simply being filled with sugars and water and nutrients. So that the amount of fruit fill is going to determine the actual fruit size. And so fruit fill is limited by potassium availability, because potassium is the locomotive that moves sugars and moves carbohydrates around within the plant and transports carbohydrates and sugars into the fruit. So when we have generous levels of potassium, we can really fill fruit very well. Whenever we have problems with fruit ripening, not ripening properly, such as green shoulder or green core, yellow shoulder on tomatoes, that is simply a challenge of the plant not having enough potassium to move enough carbohydrates into that fruit to fill that fruit properly. So now if you think about this, cell division happens in the first 2 weeks. We're dependent on calcium. Immediately after that, we switch, and now we want potassium. And those two elements antagonize each other. When we have high levels of potassium, so what happens, the one problem that we see happening consistently is in many different crops is we have generous supplies of potassium, and the high levels of potassium create a calcium deficiency that limits cell division and the quality of calcium in the embryos during the first 2 weeks of development. This is the problem with bell peppers and with Honeycrisp apples. Everyone within the apple industry knows that Honeycrisp apples have major problems with bitter pit. And the common solution, we know and understand that bitter pit is a challenge of having inadequate supplies of calcium, and so everyone is putting on intense calcium foliar applications with limited effectiveness. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not effective. The reality is that Honeycrisp apples do not have a calcium deficiency problem. It's not that they're calcium deficient. The problem is that Honeycrisp apples, and that variety in particular, has a genetic predisposition to hyperaccumulate potassium. Just to give you a frame of reference, most apple varieties will have desired ranges of potassium somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,500 to 3,000 parts per million on sap analysis. Honeycrisp apples will continue to accumulate potassium all the way up to 9,000 to 10,000 parts per million, 3 to 4 times higher than the than other apple varieties. So what happens is that they have this very high concentration of potassium, which is in effect creating a calcium deficiency. It's not that they have a calcium deficiency problem, it's that they have a problem with excess of potassium. Now this same holds true for any crop that you're growing. If you're growing strawberries or raspberries or bell peppers, it doesn't matter. Whenever you have challenges getting adequate supplies of calcium into the embryo, the first place that you need to look is you need to look at your potassium supply. So as an example of this, we are working with a cherry grower in the Hood River Valley in Oregon, and the cherry grower that we're working with is his entire emphasis is on producing premium quality fruit and very large fruit that all qualifies for the export market. So he specifically wants large fruit and firm fruit. Within cherry production, it is often the expectation that you can have either large fruit or firm fruit, but you can't have large firm fruit. That can be completely changed when you manage calcium and potassium correctly. So within cherry production, they get paid for cherries based on size and firmness. So they want large cherries, and it needs to have very firm cherries as well. So these are the reports, these are the results of a trial that we did on a 12-acre block of Bing on Mazard rootstock. These are the row sizes. The blue stripes are the AEA treatment. Orange stripes, brown stripes are the standard treatment. And just as a reference point, this guy is considered to be one of the best cherry growers in the industry. So we were able to substantially increase the number of 9-row cherries, 9.5-row cherries, and then we had less 10, 10.5, and 11-row cherries, whereas the standard treatment, they had less 9 and 9.5-row and much greater concentrations of 10 and 10.5-row. That difference in fruit size translated to a difference of $1,600 per acre in net profit. Not gross, but net, after paying for the additional nutrient applications. So the interesting part about this is the very first year that we worked with this farm. And we just did one thing on this block. We stopped the foliar applications of triple 20 before fruit fill. We stopped the potassium applications. There was no potassium applications put on from blossoming all the way up to fruit fill. What that translated to in the SAP analysis results, this is the Advancing Eco-Agriculture treated area where we eliminated potassium applications. There are 4,600 parts per million on the new leaves, 4,700 parts per million on the old. And if you look at calcium levels, you have 680 parts per million calcium on the new leaf, 656 on the old. Now on the untreated block, where the triple 20 application was still being applied, the potassium levels were 7,200 and 7,300 parts per million on the old and new versus 4,600 and 4,700. So the potassium concentrations were about 75% higher where that triple 20 was being applied. If you look at the calcium here is 534 and 763. The reality is that the calcium levels are actually less on the treated area on the untreated area than they were on the treated area. But there isn't that much of a calcium difference. There is not a really significant difference here in the calcium levels, but there is a major difference in the potassium levels. And that difference in potassium supply translated to almost an entire row size increase in cherry size. Simply by reducing potassium early, we allowed the calcium to go into the embryo, produce many more cells, and we were able to produce larger size fruit because we did not have the excessive potassium early. That was the only management difference. Clear as mud? Got it? All right. So, one last piece, and then I'll open it to questions, any questions that you might have. This last piece is that we also think very differently about increasing yields. So, a number of years ago, I started looking at the reproductive cycles within plants, and I developed this concept that we referred to as critical points of influence. So a critical point of influence is a very specific window, a very specific point in time, they're usually relatively narrow, in which a plant is going to determine a large proportion of its future reproductive potential. So I'm going to use corn as an example, even though I doubt there's very many of you here that are growing corn. I'm going to use corn as an example because it's very well studied and understood, and it's very simple to describe. So when a corn seed is planted, when you talk to geneticists and crop breeders, they will tell you that all the corn genetics available in the marketplace today have the inherent genetic potential to produce 1,100 bushels per acre. And you go, what? We're harvesting only a very small fraction of that. So on the day the corn seed is planted, you start with 1,100 bushels per acre, but then any single level of stress throughout the entire growing season is going to reduce that yield potential. So possibly the seed was planted too shallow, it didn't get good enough moisture for good germination. Now I've reduced it from 1,100 down to 900 bushels per acre. Perhaps we had a very cold, wet, windy weather at a critical point of influence 9 to 10 days after germination, and now I've reduced it from 900 down to 700 bushels per acre. Whatever it is, I'm making the numbers up. The point is that throughout the entire growing season, anytime that plant experiences stress, you're reducing that plant's yield potential until the day in which you finally harvest the crop, you're harvesting only a very small fraction of what you originally started with. This is a very important distinction, a very important thought, because what this means is that anytime we do something that produces a yield response, whether it is cultivation or a fungicide application or insecticide application, whatever the case might be, whenever we do something that produces a yield response, the reality is that we have not increased yields. We have simply kept those yields from being lost. We're simply keeping yields from being lost. It's a very subtle but important distinction. So if we look at the corn plant as an example, the corn plant has 3 specific critical points of influence. The first one is 9 to 12 days after germination. That corn plant is determining the number of ears that it could potentially have. Not that it will have, but that it could potentially have. It's ear, embryo, bud initiation. The second stage is, 14 to 19 days after germination. The plant is determining the number of rows per ear that it could potentially have. And then 42 to 49 days after germination is determining the number of kernels per row. So first is the number of ears, next is the number of rows, last is the number of kernels. Now, if you think about it, there's 2 very important pieces that emerge from this. The first is that the greatest level of yield influence happens earliest in the plant's life. If you could influence the number of ears, you can have a much greater influence on yield than if you simply influence the number of rows or the number of kernels. And secondly is the narrowness of the window. Ear determination, bud initiation for ear embryo development is 3 days, 9 to 12 days after germination. So it's a very narrow window. Any level of stress that plant experiences in that 3-day window is going to substantially reduce that plant's future yield potential. So the key, if we want to reduce yield loss, we simply need to increase these plants' stress resilience at these critical points of influence. So the reality is that many of the stress influences, some of them are definitely farmer applied, but there are also some of the greatest stress influences are from abiotic stress, where we have intense climate events, severe rainfall, hail, cold, wet, stormy weather, high heat conditions, whatever the case might be. And so we cannot change obviously we have limited influence over weather, but what we can do is we can change those plants' response to weather, and we can change those plants' physiological response to that stress by supporting them with the right nutrition. So I mapped out a very quick map of the different major critical points of influence that are associated with the various reproductive stages. You can find additional information about these critical points of influence online on our website. But very simply, the major points that you really want to pay attention to are, the first is bud initiation for perennial crops. If you're growing perennial crops, the first one is bud initiation. When are the buds being formed that are going to produce next year's crop? Then there's budded development, pollination, cell expansion, seed maturity. On perennial crops, tree fruit, strawberries, berries, doesn't matter what you're growing. The most important period, the time when you can have the biggest influence on plant development, is after harvest. If you're used to managing plants very carefully, putting on fungicide and nutrient applications up until the harvest period, and then parking the sprayer for the rest of the season, you'll want to think about changing that plan. Because you can have a bigger influence on plant health, and you can have a bigger influence on a plant's future reproductive potential after harvest than you can at any other time of the year. Why? Because after harvest, that plant is no longer under nutrient load. It's no longer under fruit load. And any nutritional products that you apply are going to have a much greater impact on that plant structure and that plant's health and immunity than they will during the fruit growing period. So you can have a tremendous impact on that plant's future reproduction and that plant's immune system by working with that plant post-harvest. You're going to have a much bigger response than you will during the growing season and prior to the harvest season. So those are my thoughts. I've been moving pretty quickly. I'll stop there. So I'm just going to open it up for questions and answers. If you guys have any questions, there's a lot of territory that I left uncovered, but yeah.
Would that influence alfalfa production too post-harvest?
So the question was, will this also influence alfalfa production? Alfalfa is interesting within this context in the way that we usually harvest alfalfa. It's not a reproductive crop. It's a vegetative crop. And so the interesting part about critical points of influence is that alfalfa as a vegetative crop is not limited by its reproductive potential. The only thing limiting alfalfa and forage production is photosynthetic efficiency. So when we talk about forage production, it is actually possible to increase forage production by as much, well basically, you can increase forage production as much as you can increase the photosynthetic efficiency, as much as 3 to 4 times. So we have growers that we're working with that are consistently harvesting 12 to 13 tons of alfalfa in a year because they're able to increase photosynthetic efficiency to that point. Yep. Yes?
How long is it when you send your leaves in? What's the turnaround time? And I know it's new. What's the cost?
So sap analysis, sample collection, Eric or Larry, I'd be happy to have you answer these questions as well. The samples, the leaves need to arrive fresh. They cannot be dehydrated. So at this point, we are still exporting samples to the Netherlands for analysis. We are intending to establish a laboratory here in the U.S. in the near future to conduct the analysis here. But when the samples are collected, they are packed with cold packs and overnight shipped to Ohio, where we aggregate samples from all over the U.S., pack them, and then overnight them to the Netherlands. And then the analysis is conducted usually within 24 to 48 hours of arrival, and the results are emailed back. So the first couple of years when we worked with the laboratory, the turnaround was very consistently 5 days. 5 days from sample collection to when the grower had the report. This last year, the lab was overextended. They've been very busy, and we were running 5 to 8 days. So still, even with that 8-day turnaround, we're still very competitive with other laboratories here in the U.S. in terms of turnaround time frame. And the advantage is that even if you compare it with tissue analysis, you now still have data that is 3 to 4 weeks, a precursor of what a tissue analysis would show.
On your corn example, you mentioned the 3 stages and the critical points of influence. Does SAP not necessarily apply to those farmers then?
So the question was, does SAP analysis not necessarily apply to corn production and to those specific challenges? Yes, it absolutely does. And what you can utilize SAP analysis to identify any nutritional imbalances at those critical points of influence and prevent them from limiting yield. Yep. We had a question over here. Yep.
Yeah, on varieties, because each variety could be different when, so when you take the SAP analysis, there's leaves for the SAP analysis, you got to keep it variety specific then, right?
Yes. You do need to keep it.
You have, say, a high tunnel that has 3 different varieties of tomatoes there. You need 3 separate.
You either need to use, when you have a smaller operation that has a number of different varieties, you can test each of the varieties individually, or what most farmers tend to do is they select one variety as an indicator species, and they just measure one variety and then they manage everything else to that variety. And that works for smaller operations. However, we're seeing consistently, if you have a larger scale operation and you have a substantial block size of one variety, it is worth managing that specific variety. The strawberry growers and the cherry growers that we're working with on the West Coast, are now fine-tuning their nutrition to each specific variety, and we're able to get to another higher plateau of performance. And we're able to, I mean, there's strawberries are an extreme example, but with strawberries, we have found that some strawberry varieties can require 3 times as much nitrogen as other varieties. So some varieties will self-balance their nitrogen levels in the old versus new leaves at about 600 to 700 parts per million. Others are looking for 1,900 to 2,200 parts per million. There's some very dramatic and very distinct varietal differences in strawberries. We've seen the same in cherries and apples. Within smaller operations, we do tend to use indicator species or indicator varieties and manage to those varieties. But larger operations, it is very worthwhile managing them separately. Yes?
I have a couple of quick questions. On our blackberries, we're on a rotating trellis now, so they're all laid down and covered up. They'll soon be uncovered and raised up. At what point would we begin to, at what point would we take leaves, you know, for sap analysis? And the second question is cost.
Yeah, and that was an earlier question that I failed to answer as well. So we begin sap analysis sample collection as soon as we have green leaves in the spring. And we take that all the way through. Now, early stages of development, the first 1 or 2 sets of samples that you take, you may only be getting a single leaf because there isn't enough spread to do old versus new. So the first several sample sets, the first several weeks of sample collection might only be for a single sample. And then later on in the growing season, you expand to doing old and new. Larry, do you want to comment on pricing, the cost of sap analysis?
Yes. Agro-K is very interested in encouraging this technology, and so we have purchased a large number of sap analysis that we want to use with growers, and so our cost is $45 per sample
Per set.
per set, small and young and old per set. But we would encourage you, of course, to do more than 1 set. We would like you to select a variety or an issue or a block and follow it through the whole season. It is excellent information for Agro-K. It's excellent information for you, and we want to use this technology to help you manage what John has been talking about in terms of improving fruit quality and fruit yield. So, and minimizing the pest problem. So we Agro-K are supplementing the cost of this test. We are encouraging you to participate. We will supplement the cost to do it, and that is good experience for us, good information for us as we develop fertility plans and programs for you.
And the database, can we develop our own database or from the analysis, or is it too complicated? Or
you mean the database for sap analysis?
well, after, yeah.
You have access to all the data.
Yeah, every sap analysis that you've done, you will have a copy that you will use. You will have recommendations based on that copy, and we would hope that you would keep that as a history. This block is your history on your soil, your variety, and your climate. We want you to keep that and use that in terms of reference for future planning. As John said, sometimes something runs out and you realize that's something we got to correct next year, and so you make a soil application, or your timing is for your foliar corrects that.
I know it's just
One-
a little question, but on our leaves, and we collect them, we keep them separate, we put them in baggies and ship them right away.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, and we have very clearly outlined instruction manuals for sample collection that are available online on the Crop Health Lab's website. I'm sure Agro-K is going to have them as well. One of the other pieces worth mentioning is that the laboratory has a very different way of managing samples than a usual tissue analysis laboratory. If you're used to using tissue analysis, you're probably familiar with, you see a problem out in the field, you're able to collect samples and you send them to the laboratory and they run an analysis, send you results, and you get an invoice 2 weeks or a month later. That can happen on very rare occasions with this laboratory, but they are very resistant to operating in that fashion. They want growers to use them consistently throughout the entire growing season, and they run tens of thousands of samples. So their entire system is computerized using barcode scanning. They want you to put an order together in the spring that says, okay, I'm going to test this sample or this field of strawberries 8 times throughout the growing season. So I want 8 sample sets for this variety in this field. You put all the information in, send them the order. They will print out bar-coded labels for you to use for that crop for the growing season with old and new leaves. So then when the samples get to the laboratory, they just simply run the barcode and run the sample. They do not have the bandwidth during the intense sample analysis season to manually put in all that data and do all the data entry.
So you have to pre-order. You have to pre-order this, and that's if you are interested, that's exactly what we want to know, and we will be putting together our SAP analysis orders as we that was part of this meeting to explain to you what we need. And after lunch, we'll actually go through the procedure and show you just a little bit how to do it. So it seems like a foreign world. It is tedious, and yet it is worth the time and effort you put into it. And if you do it properly, such valuable information is returned to you in terms of managing your crop, your variety, what you're working with. John, we thank you.
Thank you all for being here.